Thank you. I am delighted to be here in the beautiful city of Istanbul, and especially to share the stage with so many inspiring thought leaders here at Brand Week. So what I want to talk to you about today is the sharing economy, and in particular the future of the sharing economy, so how this might develop over, say, the next 10 years. When I say the sharing economy, what I'm referring to is platforms that allow for access rather than ownership of either experiences or objects, so any type of resources, typically facilitated through the digital. So if you think of platforms like Uber or Airbnb, this is what I'm referring to when I talk about the sharing economy. So about 10 years ago is when the sharing economy first emerged, and at that time I was living in Boston, and what is still today the largest car-sharing company in the world, called Zipcar, it was headquartered there. And when they were first starting out, the company was founded by a couple of ex-hippies, and the whole idea behind Zipcar was, we're going to eliminate single car ownership. We're going to reduce everyone's carbon footprint. This is going to be such an environmentally friendly way to travel. Everyone is going to be sharing the same fleet of cars within the city of Boston and hopefully the world eventually, and we're going to achieve these amazing environmental outputs and consequences of doing this. And so the whole purpose was, as I said, to achieve these types of lowering individual carbon footprint goals. We can also think about another platform that emerged around this time 10 years ago called Couchsurfing. I don't know if you remember them. They're still around, by the way, although they've kind of been usurped by Airbnb in terms of the popularity of staying in someone's home, but they are still around. And with Couchsurfing, the idea was when you travel to another city or country or wherever you might be going, you stay in someone's home rather than staying at a hotel, so that you can connect on a personal level and learn something new about a new culture through staying in someone's home. And so this was going to have amazing social consequences. The sort of alienation that people were starting to feel from living in a digital culture where we communicate via devices was going to be alleviated by this great facilitation of us all sharing our new social connections with each other all around the world. So you can see that there were these very idealistic ideas about what was going to come out of the sharing economy: social value, environmental value, etc. So let's fast forward to today, 10 years later from then to today, and what do we see in terms of what's happening with sharing economy platforms now? Well, the first thing that we can talk about is the environmental goals that I mentioned before. If we look at something like Uber, which is ride sharing, not car sharing, but the idea behind this was supposed to be the same in terms of its lowering people's carbon footprints, what research has shown in the past decade is that people who use ride sharing apps, it's actually a substitute for public transportation. It's not a substitute for individually owned cars. So we haven't really seen the lowering of individuals' carbon footprints through all of these new platforms that have made different forms of transportation available. Another thing that has emerged with the sharing economy is that as a consumer, when we are accessing all of these, whether it's experiences or objects or whatever it might be, the people within the system are anonymous others. And what I mean by that is you don't personally know them. So in order to overcome the trust barrier that comes along with, should I get into a car with this person that I don't know? Should I spend the night in someone's home who has the keys to this house who I don't know? What has developed is reputation systems, which I think we're all familiar with. We all rate each other when we use these platforms, and that's used as a barometer of trust for these anonymous others. Well, within these rating systems, what research has shown again in the past decade is that there can be discrimination built into the platforms. And so what I mean by that is if you are black, for example, it's much harder to book a place on Airbnb. And so for example, even if you have the same ratings as someone who is white, a person accepting you to come into their home as a guest, there's a much lower chance of that. And we can see it across other platforms as well. So there are issues about discrimination that have arisen because of how the nature of these reputation systems have developed. And the final point here, I'll say, is with regards to regulations. And what I mean by that is Most of these sharing economy companies say we're a platform, we're not an actual company. So we are the the platform that is able to connect someone who needs a ride with someone who's driving their car around and would like to give someone a ride, and we simply connect those two. So we don't have employees, etc. What this has led to is that people who drive for Uber, for example, even if they choose to do it enough hours that it would be classified as full-time work, do not get paid what is minimum wage typically in most countries. And this has led to a whole host of different lawsuits, etc. So in London now, Uber drivers are classified as employees now, but this is quite different in different cities. And we can see the same thing with Airbnb, for example. They say, well, we're not a hotel company, we're just a platform connecting people with an extra room, so we don't need to pay the same taxes that the hotels do. Well, in New York City, guess what's happened? Of course, the hotel industry has sued Airbnb, saying, no, you should have to pay the same taxes as we do. That's part of the reason why we are more expensive than you and why people are choosing you over us, so it's not fair competition. So all these types of issues have come up that have not been resolved yet in terms of legislation, which has made the whole space a little bit more tumultuous, I think, than the idealistic founders thought it would be a decade ago. So how can we understand what's happened in the past decade and what might come in the future? The first thing I think it's important to understand, and you've probably guessed this by what I've just been saying in terms of how the sharing economy is developed, but the sharing economy is not about sharing. I wrote an article about this topic for Harvard Business Review a few years ago, and in it argued that it should be called the access economy, because what consumers really want is not necessarily to share, whether it's objects or experiences, with other people. So if we think about Airbnb, for example, most of the time when someone stays in an Airbnb home, the owner of that home isn't there. And you can choose that option when you book on the platform, and that is the option that the majority of people choose. So it's not really about sharing with others, it's about having the ability to access rather than own. And I think this is a really important shift in consumer behavior. The fact that consumers would rather access whatever it is that they need and don't necessarily strive for ownership as much as they used to anymore. So that's what I'd like to explore a little bit further now. I think one of the ways that we can understand this is through a concept that I find really useful, which is how modern life has become liquidified. So this is a concept developed by the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, and which I've used in my research on liquid consumption. And basically the idea here is that everyday life used to be solid, so there used to be a lot of stable social systems. People would have the same job for their whole life. They might live in the same village for their whole life. You might have the same circle of friends that you've had, so there's trust built into the way that you live your life. That is no longer the case for most people, and so the term is that daily life and daily social structures have become more liquid. So what this means is that things aren't as stable. There's a lot more precarity. People go from job to job. There's a lot of more entrepreneurship, people moving from city to city to be able to, chase the next job. People's social circles changing all the time, of course, being enabled by the digital. Some of your friends you may have never even met in real life. And so all those types of aspects of daily life have become more liquid. And one of the consequences of this is that because people are pursuing liquidity, ownership is seen as a burden rather than as something to strive for. So I think we can all remember the days, even if it was our parents and not us, when you got your first great job and maybe you went out and bought yourself a watch to celebrate because it was kind of a sign and a symbol that you had made it somehow. Or maybe it was the case with a particular brand of car or whatever it was. But the point is that ownership was something that people aspired towards, and it had a status and a symbolic meaning that kind of everyone within society understood. Now, ownership is seen more as a burden. So if I'm constantly moving around, to different cities Do I really want to own a lot of things that I have to bring with me all of the time? Do I even want a permanent office, or would I rather engage in co-working where I can access space in whatever city that I would like and have the added benefits of networking on top of that? So there's this idea that striving for ownership is no longer something that we see represented in a lot of consumer trends. You can see this clearly with things like diamond rings and with the millennial generation and below, the dropping numbers in terms of how many people buy objects like this. But like I said, I think this is kind of a profound shift that really underlies the growth of the sharing economy and why platforms that can facilitate access have proliferated so much. And then the second point here, which we've already touched upon, is that in order for this to work, high levels of trust are needed. But most of the people within these systems aren't necessarily people that you know. So you've seen the growth of these reputation systems where kind of your value within society lies in your ratings. So, you know, there's all sorts of jokes about when you go out on a first date with someone that you've met on Tinder. They say, so what's your Uber rating? But what we can see already in China, for example, if you've heard about China's social credit score, is that this idea that we all have a score that other people can see to interpret our trustworthiness is something that is going to become more and more common even outside of China in the future. In China, your score, by the way, is based on much more than just your ratings in terms of the different sharing economy platforms that you're engaged in. Your overall score can depend on things like how much alcohol you bought with your credit card the last time you went to the grocery store, if you jaywalk or not when you're crossing the street, and there's all sorts of inputs that go into your score, which are fascinating to think about if this is going to spread to other places or not. But again, this is a consequence of liquidity. Because everything is so liquid, we don't know these people personally, we need these types of reputation systems. So we are at Brand Week after all. Let's talk a little bit about what the implications for branding might be given the way that the sharing economy has developed so far. So, first here, we have this idea that there is a weaker connection between brands that you access and consumer identity. So what do I mean by that? I think it's a truism of branding in the past that we think about brands as an extension of the self. So a consumer is expressing his or her identity through the brands that they choose to consume, in particular in a public way. When you access brands, this connection is not necessarily as clear. So what do I mean by this? If we think about the platform Bag Borrower Steal, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but it's a way to access handbags, and you sort of set up a queue like you would with your Netflix queue. So you might have your Prada handbag at the top, and next is a Louis Vuitton one, and then a Gucci one, and a Chanel one, and you get mailed the first handbag in your queue. When you've finished with it, you mail it back, and then you get mailed the second one, etc. So basically, every couple weeks, you can have a different brand of handbag if you want. What are the implications for this from a branding perspective? Well, people are no longer a Chanel person and expressing kind of who I am and something about me by virtue of having Chanel, because next week I'm going to have Louis Vuitton, and the week after that I'm going to have Prada. So a lot of the assumptions about how we can make connections with consumers and what the meaning of brands is to consumers is kind of being upended by a lot of these systems. So next here, which I think is also really important, is that the brand experience is not necessarily delivered by employees. I think as people who work in branding, I'm sure that you spend a lot of time coming up with ways to get all sorts of employees who don't work in the marketing department on board with what the brand means and how that experience can be delivered. Well, with a lot of these platforms, there's no possible way to do that. I mean, think about Airbnb. The person who is hosting the guest is never going to be an employee. They are going to be a person who has a spare room. And so you will never have control over that experience in the way that you would if it were an employee. So kind of thinking about how brand experiences are delivered and how they can be redesigned, because there won't be the sort of training programs and indoctrination programs that you can have with people who are actually employees. The next point I think is an important one as well. What my research has shown, as well as others, is that within the sharing economy, consumers don't necessarily want to be part of a brand community in the way that they do with other brands. And I think this is directly related to the not having as close of an identity attachment to the brands within these systems. Zipcar, for example, that I mentioned I did research with back when they first started, they wanted to create this community of Zipsters. So the idea was, every time you drive past another Zipcar, beep and wave, and they tried to create these Zip meetups at pubs on Friday nights, because the idea was if we can get these people to know each other, they'll be better in terms of returning the car on time when the next person has it reserved at a particular time, etc. Well, none of those initiatives worked. People were not interested in being a part of a community with others, again, because you don't have that tight identity attachment. So a term that's been used, and not just a term, but a concept that I think is really illustrative within this space, is the idea of brand publics. And what this refers to is, in the digital space, brands are being used to create a public for individuals. So what do I mean by that? So let's think about Instagram. Someone will post a photo of themselves, and maybe they're holding a coffee cup of Starbucks, and they'll do hashtag Starbucks. The reason why you would do this isn't to connect with other people who also love Starbucks so that you can be in a community of like-minded people, but it's because Starbucks has such a large following that you're increasing the number of people who are going to see your post. So essentially, you're using the brand to create a broader public for yourself. And this is what we see happening a lot in terms of the relationships between consumers and brands within the sharing economy space, using the brand as a way to create a public. Again, something quite different that I think as brand managers we're used to conceptualizing. The question I always get asked is, can luxury brands emerge in the sharing economy space? So far, what the brand plays tend to have been in this space is focusing on convenience, so on providing that access rather than ownership. So it's almost a utilitarian value to the consumers. I think that that's going to change. So Airbnb, for example, is rumored. It is rumored that they are going to be launching Airbnb Luxe, which is going to be properties that they've built themselves, which is going to be of a higher standard than, I guess, any of our spare rooms. And so I think that we're going to start to see some things emerging, but what my research has shown is that if there can be luxury offerings in this space, it's going to be offerings that can facilitate either flexibility. So in Liquidity, when people need to be flexible and to be able to move and change quickly, offerings that can facilitate that are having more and more status, and also offerings that can facilitate attention. So I'm not sure if you've heard the term attention capital, but the idea is, in particular in an online space, the currency that garners people's status and distinction is attention. So how can you get more attention in the form of likes or shares or comments or things like that? So let's think about many popular influencers, for example. On Instagram, they never want to be shown wearing the same outfit twice. So Rent the Runway, if you're familiar with that platform, this is where you can get high-end clothes, again, in a similar way to Bag Borrow or Steal that I mentioned, so you can have a different outfit every weekend. And the idea behind this is, it's not because you can't afford to buy your own clothes, you could, but you don't want to have that permanent wardrobe because you can't wear your clothes, at least online anyway, a second time anyway. So this type of platform facilitates the garnering of attention in a way that is meaningful to a lot of people who make their living, in particular, through these types of digital platforms and through having the currency of attention. So this is something that I think is going to gain a lot more cachet and where we'll see the emergence of luxury brands in this space. And so the final point here, I guess, is the relationship between the consumer and the producer, or the service provider, if you will, has always been something that has been really important in terms of customer satisfaction and how well a brand experience can be implemented. And in the sharing economy, oftentimes the consumer and the service provider are the same person. And so the term that we use for this is prosumer. And I really like that term, actually. It was developed by the sociologist George Ritzer, but I tend to use it a lot in my own work because It captures this idea that there's really no longer a distinction between the two. So the same person who is staying at an Airbnb in Istanbul for the weekend can be hosting someone else in London the next weekend. So they are the service provider as well as the consumer. So what this means from a brand standpoint is that the role of the prosumer isn't just, how can we get you on board with our brand message or meaning, but also how can we get you to deliver our brand message or meaning, because you're actually the one delivering it, not just consuming it, if you will. So again, something that I think is a brand management issue that needs to be thought more about in terms of what we've seen and more changes made to facilitate this. So, okay, let's turn, I guess, a little bit more directly towards the future and what is happening with the development now. Basically, as I mentioned, the sharing economy has been around for about 10 years now. What do we think is going to happen in the next 10 years? The first question that it's important to think about, I guess, is there still any possibility that there can be societal value coming out of these sharing economy platforms? Kind of what I described as the reality of what's happened so far has pushed back a little bit against the environmental and social potential benefits that a lot of the initial founders thought there could be. Have we given up on that, or are there any glimmers of hope? The first area where I think there's a glimmer of hope is in the realm of food sharing. So there have been many innovations in different cities with regards to using the type of sharing economy apps and platforms to facilitate the reduction of food waste and trying to address hunger and homelessness. So in London, for example, there's a great startup called Olio, and they are neighborhood-based, and so basically if you have extra food that you're not going to be using, they provide a way for you to get it to someone very close to you in your neighborhood who's affiliated with an organization that can then distribute it to people who need food that day, so that you don't have to throw away the food that you thought you were going to eat or use or whatever, and you didn't. And they've been very successful so far, and there's lots of other examples like that too. So I think there is still, these platforms can still be used to have some of the benefits that we talked about before. The other area that I see a glimmer of hope is what's called collective stewardship. So what I mean by this is when platforms can facilitate a sense of collective stewardship over the objects that are being accessed themselves, you tend to see some pro-social benefits. So I'm not sure if you've heard of clothing libraries. These are popping up in a lot of cities around the world. But the idea is the same as a regular library where you would go to get books. There is an array of clothes, and you can go in and with your membership card check clothes out. You have to bring them back in a week or else you get fined, just like you do with books. And then the next person can take it out. Of course, there's a washing and dry cleaning component that takes place in the middle before the next person takes it out. But when people feel a sense of collective stewardship over these items, you tend to see them treating them better, facilitating more of a sense of community with the other people who are doing this, because they typically have pro-environmental goals in terms of why they're participating in these types of programs. So I'd like to leave you with a final kind of three thoughts about, in terms of moving forward in this space, what some key tools for success can be. So the first is embracing the paradox that I've described in the sharing economy, not necessarily pushing back against it. So what I mean by the paradox is, on the one hand, you have this idea that we're sharing resources now rather than individually consuming, we're accessing rather than owning, and from doing that, we can have these pro-environmental, pro-social outcomes. But at the same time, a term that I like, which I've read a couple times in different analyses, is that at the same time, the sharing economy is kind of turned into capitalism on steroids. At the beginning, it was going to replace capitalism. We were all going to share with each other and not have to engage in market exchange. But in the end, the type of market exchange that's happened with surge pricing, the way Uber uses it, et cetera. A lot of people have called it capitalism on steroids. So you have these two kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. And what brands have tended to do within this space is to try and champion kind of one or the other. But I think embracing the paradox, knowing that consumers still have a desire for the first one, you can see that it's still called the sharing economy. It hasn't changed into being called the access economy because people still like to think that they're engaging in something that is kind of better, if you will, in terms of sharing than just regular consumption. But at the same time figuring out, well, how can we classify people who work for us as employees, for example, and give them benefits so that we don't get the negative types of publicity that you see around a lot of platforms. Embracing that paradox, I think, is a great way to move forward. Embracing the maturation of the sharing economy. During its first decade, a lot of the sharing economy was basically startups. It was a startup culture. A lot of it was venture capital funded. Many of the original platforms still have not made a profit today. They're still being funded by venture capital. So I think, but this is not necessarily the case anymore. You're starting to see, as I mentioned before, Airbnb is investing in building actual buildings. Uber is investing in buying its own cars rather than just having people drive their own car. And you're starting to see investment in different areas that is taking a different shape. So it's no longer about being a platform that's connecting this person with this person, but actual investment is happening in physical resources, if you will. So realizing that that this whole space is maturing and that it's going to develop in a different way to kind of the startup way that we've seen to date is something important to keep in mind. And the final point here is embracing new technologies. So I think you've probably heard a lot and been talking a lot here at Brand Week about blockchain and what the different potentials can be. In the sharing economy, a lot of people talk about blockchain as an answer to this reputation system problem. Like, we can't trust anonymous others within the system that we're sharing with, but with blockchain, we can perhaps eliminate the reputation systems that result in the different types of discrimination, et cetera, that I talked about, because there is an inherent trust built into blockchain that you don't necessarily see with other types of reputation systems. So a lot of people talk about that as kind of a shining star, if you will, in terms of how this space might develop. And I would also say that we might see the elimination of the human element altogether. And what I mean by this is Elon Musk talks a lot in terms of the development of Tesla electric cars. He talks a lot about driverless cars. And he says, my vision is to have a whole fleet of Tesla electric car, driverless cars going around picking up people whenever they want it. So you don't need an Uber driver to come pick you up. You can just call your Tesla without a driver, and it comes and gets you and picks you up. And you eliminate a lot of the kind of negative externalities that I've been talking about in terms of the reputation systems, whether people are employees or not, et cetera. So this is another way that I see the sharing economy developing, and something that I think it's important to think about as we think about developing brands within this space. So thank you very much for having me, and I hope I get a chance to chat about some of these issues with you later today. Thanks.